Today I am going to discuss an important topic from the osteology, that is a part of a long bone. This is a long bone. As you already aware that there are three parts of a long bone. The central part, which is the strongest part of a long bone, shaft of a long bone, cortical part of a long bone, that is known as the diaphysis, which ossify from the primary center of ossification, and in the center we have the medullary cavity. And the important point that it is characterized by the Haversian system. So we'll discuss Haversian system in the next slide. So this is about the shaft of a long bone, is known as the diaphysis. Then we have the metaphysis, and at the end there are two ends of the long bone known as epiphysis, right? So metaphysis is the area which is present between the diaphysis and the epiphysis. How to define the metaphysis? Basically, it is a part of a diaphysis facing towards the epiphysis. This is a one way to define. The another way to define the metaphysis, that it is a epiphyseal end of a diaphysis facing towards the epiphysis. So we can define the metaphysis in two ways, right? And the important point that we should remember, that there is a hairpin bend like a structure is present in the metaphyseal area, and it is very important because clinically it is important because there is a disease of a bone which is known as the osteomyelitis, inflammation of the bone, very common in children due to presence of the hairpin bend like a structure, that again we will discuss in the upcoming video. Today the part that we are going to discuss, that is the epiphysis. So epiphysis is a end of a long bone, right? There are four parts of epiphysis: pressure epiphysis, traction epiphysis, atavistic epiphysis, and aberrant epiphysis. So four types of epiphysis. Yes, four types of epiphysis. So there are four types of epiphysis. Number one, that is pressure epiphysis. That is pressure epiphysis. What is pressure epiphysis? Pressure epiphysis is those part of epiphysis which transmit the weight, which takes the pressure, which makes the joint. So if you see the upper end of the humerus, this is the upper end of the humerus, this is the head of the humerus. So head of the humerus is making a joint which transmits the weight, which takes the pressure. So this is an example of the pressure epiphysis. The next example, that head of the femur. This is again example of the pressure epiphysis. So there are two examples, right? So what are the examples? The examples are the head of the humerus, head of femur. Then we have the tibia and tibia, the condyles of the tibia, the condyles of the femur, they are also participating in the formation of joint. So these are again an example of the pressure epiphysis. What are the other example? Yes, the condyles of the femur, the condyles of the tibia. So these are the example of the pressure epiphysis. So if you see the pressure epiphysis, they always make joint, right? The next epiphysis, that is known as traction epiphysis. So the another type, that is the traction epiphysis. What is traction epiphysis? Traction epiphysis is those part of epiphysis which develop due to the continuously pulling or traction of the tendon or ligament. So if you see the upper part of the humerus, you can appreciate there are two projections. One projection which is known as the lesser tubercle, and another projection which is known as the greater tubercle. So these two projections, the lesser and the greater tubercle, that develop due to the continuously traction or pulling of the tendon of a muscle. That's why it's example of the traction epiphysis. If you see the lower end of the humerus, you can see there are two projections. One is the medial epicondyle and another is the lateral epicondyle. So these two epicondyles are the example of the traction epiphysis. So all the epicondyle word, whenever you hear the word epicondyle, they are always the example of the traction epiphysis. Condyles are the example of the pressure epiphysis. Epicondyles are the example of the traction epiphysis. If you see the radius, there is a projection, lower part of the radius, asteroid process of the radius, asteroid process of the ulna. These two projections are again an example of the traction epiphysis. In the tibia and fibula, we have the two projection malleoli, the lateral malleolus, the medial malleolus. These are the example of the traction epiphysis, right? So what are the example? Let's write the example. That is greater and lesser tubercle of humerus, greater and lesser tubercle of femur. What are the another example? Yes, all the epicondyles, the medial epicondyle, the lateral epicondyle, the asteroid process of radius and ulna, the asteroid process of the radius and ulna. What are the another example? The malleolus, right? So these are the projection. This projection has been developed due to the traction or continuously pulling of the muscle. So these are example of the traction epiphysis. The third type of epiphysis, this is known as atavistic epiphysis. The third type of epiphysis, that is known as atavistic epiphysis. What is atavistic epiphysis? What is atavism? Basically, initially there are two different bones. During the evolution in the human, the two different bones fuse together, form a one complete bone, but there is a projection that is residing behind them. So if you see the scapula, what you can see here, there is a process which is known as the coracoid process of the scapula, right? So basically the coracoid process and the scapula, these are the two different bones in ancestors, but during the evolution both the bones fuse together, form a one bone, but there is a projection that is residing here, and this projection is providing the surface for the attachment of the muscle, and this is an example of the which epiphysis? Atavistic epiphysis, right? In the lower mammals, these are the separate bones, but in the human, during the evolution, these two bones fuse together, form a one complete bone. So the example is, yes, coracoid process. So if you see the image of the scapula, we can appreciate there is a process which is known as the coracoid process, and this is an example of the atavistic epiphysis. The another example in the foot, that is a posterior tubercle of the talus. So behind the talus, sometime if you do the X-ray and unfortunately or accidentally you find there is a small projection that is present behind the talus, and this projection is known as the os trigonum. So if I will show the image, you can see this image, there is a small projection, and this projection is present behind the talus, and this is known as the os trigonum. So this is the another example. So only there are two examples of the human. The two, one is the coracoid process of the scapula and another that is the os trigonum. So these are only two examples, so it is to remember. If you see the X-ray, so this is the X-ray, you can see, you can again appreciate there is a posterior tubercle, and this is nothing but it is a os trigonum. It is a os trigonum, right? So this is a second example of the atavistic epiphysis. The next epiphysis, which is known as the aberrant epiphysis. What does it mean? Aberrantly present. That means it should not be present, but it is aberrantly present. So in case of the miniature long bone, we have the different types of long bone. In case of the miniature long bone, we have the metatarsals, the phalanges, these are the example of miniature long bone. So in the metatarsal, this is a not metatarsal, metacarpal. This is my metacarpal. This is the first metacarpal, second, third, fourth, and fifth metacarpal. So generally, in the miniature long bone, only one epiphysis is present. So at the base of the first metacarpal, the epiphysis is present, and at the top of the remaining metacarpals, we have the epiphysis. There should be one epiphysis, that is normally, that is physiologically. But if the another epiphysis will be present at the base of, at the top of the first metacarpal and at the base of the rest metacarpals, then they are the example of which epiphysis? Aberrant epiphysis. That means aberrantly present, right? Yes. So in this is a metacarpal, this is a first metacarpal, this is a second metacarpal, this is a third, fourth, and this is a fifth metacarpal. So usually what actually happens, the epiphysis that is present normally at the base of the first metacarpal and at the top of the second, third, fourth, and fifth metacarpal. This is a basically general physiology. But if you find one another epiphysis, if this is present at the top of the first metacarpal and at the base of the remaining metacarpal, so these epiphysis, they are example of the which epiphysis? Aberrant epiphysis. That means aberrantly present. So this will be the example of the aberrant epiphysis, right? So this is again the aberrant epiphysis, right? So that means it is the aberrantly present. So this is all about the part of a 4 parts of the epiphysis, that is, yes, pressure epiphysis, traction epiphysis, atavistic epiphysis, and aberrant epiphysis. Okay, thank you very much.